Hi, everyone. Our next speaker is Jeremiah McCall. Jeremiah McCall has a PhD in Roman history and specializes in historical game studies, history, and pedagogies using video and board games, and sometimes the military and political cultural systems of the Roman Republic. He has taught high school history, his calling, at Cincinnati Country Day School in Ohio for the past 22 years. His book, Gaming the Past, is the foundational work for teaching history using video games, as is his website, gamingthepast.net, which we have links to in our exhibition hall. He has also written a number of investigations of the Roman world, which is a long list. And again, check out the exhibition hall for the list of those books. Currently, he is at work researching and writing Designing Historical Games for Classrooms, a practical guide for educators. Despite his busy teaching and writing schedules, he still manages to play more video games than you'd think he'd have time for. His first presentation today is Peasant Farmers, Murder Victims, or Crop Producers: How Genres and Historical Problem Spaces Shape the History in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Hegemony, Wars of Ancient Greece. And here's our presenter, Jeremiah McCall.
Thank you. I was hoping that I'd get my face on here too, but the camera doesn't seem to be working, but that's okay. It looks like you can see my slides. So here we go. And pardon me, I am very new to GatherTown. Let me just find Okay. All right, so peasant farmers are murder victims. One of the big things that I spend time on as a history teacher and also as a historian and as a historical game studies scholar is what kind of history can be done with a game. Basically, we're in the mindset these days that history isn't really as narrowly defined as a text that somebody reads or presents, or a narrative or things like that, but that rather history is anything where you can selectively interpret the past, if you will. So I'm working from a definition of history as a selective interpretation of the past. You can talk about whether history fits the evidence or doesn't fit the evidence, who created it, why they created it, but at the end of the day, whatever medium it is, it's still history if it's selectively interpreting the past. So with that in mind, I think that different games, it's been my experience at least, that different games have different interpretations of media, different ways that they present the past. So over on the left, I've got my doodle here, where history is basically you've got stuff left behind from the past, right? And you have your scrolls and tombstones and pictures and books and fragments of stuff. And then you put it into a big sort of blender of sorts. And I have this one labeled Doing History in the Game Medium, though it could just as easily be Doing History in the Narrative Text Medium or something like that. And what you get when you blend it in the game medium is you get a video game, and there's Assassin's Creed, one of our video games. So what a game does, it seems to me, more than anything else, a historical game, is it turns the past into a historical problem space. Let me go through a couple of terms. This is not meant to be a complicated thing. It's simply when I say that the game represents the historical problem space, what it's doing is presenting the world as a player agent with goals in a game world. Oh, there I am. Hi, me. With game goals, tools, obstacles, agents, and resources. And so you have a player agent getting into sort of action-oriented behavior in a world full of stuff so that they can try and or achieve their game goals. So that's all I mean by a historical problem space. Anytime you play a historical game, as far as I've seen so far anyways, you've got goals, a player agent, and a world that they're doing their things in. So what I've found is that in the historical problem space, and I have an article on this coming out that I cited in the first slide, and I've got other work. You can find me at any point on gamingthepast.net. What I've found is that genre is a really important part of how a game presents history. That the historical problem space, the combination of player agents and goals and environment and everything working together, changes very much according to genre. And so that could be player agent attributes. If you played a game like Assassin's Creed, you're a person embodied character, right? If you played a historical game like Call of Duty, you're still embodied, but you don't actually see yourself over the shoulder or anything like that. If you play a real-time strategy, you don't see your character at all that you're playing as. So the attributes of player agents, the goals that they're setting, is it finish the storyline or quest? Is it build a certain amount of buildings? Is it conquer enough territory? Your interactions with the game world. Is the game world something like Assassin's Creed where you can climb up and down buildings and go parkour? Or is it more like a strategy game where the background or sort of the terrain is more buffs and minuses for fighting and things like that? And then there's the question of what does the game actually procedurally simulate, by which I mean they got an actual working model in the code that is representing something in the real world. And to what extent are they just giving audio-visual representations? So showing a picture of something, but not simulating the activity that it represents. Anyways, we're going to get into this in some more detail in a moment. So let's go to our next slide. So how do you do an HPS analysis, historical problem space analysis? And I should say, why would you? I think there's several major reasons that this is a good thing to learn. One is speaking to teachers. The historical problem space framework, with its idea of player agents and goals and resources and things like that, gives us tools for talking about games and how they represent the past. They give us tools that we can talk to our students about. And if you come to my second presentation later, I'll be focused more on how do you get students to play historical games and then really get some critical thinking skills and exercise out of them. So that's one reason you'd do it. Another reason you'd do it is if you're interested in historical game studies and just interested in how history games portray the past. This is a media-centric approach. It says, let's take a game as a game and analyze it like that. And then you might just be interested in history and games, in which case, hopefully this is a slightly cool way of looking at it. All right. So how do I do an HPS analysis? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and describe in detail each part of it. I'm going to describe the player agent in the game. I'm going to describe the game goals. I'm going to describe who the non-player agents are. But then I'm looking for big picture. Why does a functional and cohesive historical game present the historical record the way it does? So, functional and cohesive. Video games are both functional, by which I mean they have to run through a compiler. They're made of math, and the code has to run. But they're also cohesive. They are designed by game designers who want to have the elements work together. Usually, if they're not trying to make a point with unharmonious elements, usually cohesion is considered a positive goal for game designers. So what you shouldn't be doing, I think, is looking at different parts of a game as history and saying, oh, that's really bad. Why is it that way? And then just thinking you're done with the question. Rather, why is that thing in the game taking the shape and form that it is? How does it fit in with the rest of this game that it's obligated to fit in with because it's been designed cohesively and functionally? So, what are the effects of this? And then what kind of histories do distinct kinds of historical games present? Is kind of the last big question. So these are kind of the things that I'm going to ask about these two games that we'll look at. All right, so first of all, an overview. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, right, you've got a third person over-the-shoulder approach. Sorry, my speaker notes aren't advancing, so I'll make sure I got that. Okay. You've got, this is something that's very similar in genre to Red Dead Redemption games, Grand Theft Auto games, Plague Tale Requiem, right? You're an embodied player. You take up space in the virtual game world, and you've got a following camera with a 3D world. But Assassin's Creed Odyssey is also operating under what we can call a brand genre. Certain genres of games associated with brands start to get features that become really characteristic. And that's not always a perfect guide. Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft made some design decisions in the latest Mirage, and I think they also did in Valhalla, that made it different in some important ways from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So it's not a fixed hard rule, but it's a really good question to say to yourself when you're trying to figure out how a game approaches history. What have the other games in this series done so far, and what are some of the expectations? Here's some things that were in Assassin's Creed, the series up to the time, developing up to the time of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. As I told you, an embodied player agent, right? You can see your character moving around. I'm going to refer to the character as Cassandra because that's who I played as and I like her better. Um, a 3D game space that's meant to represent verisimilarly the world around it, and it has to be traversed. And it should be traversed ideally through parkour methods, right? And in-game physics. So you should be having some experience of the physics of jumping and leaping and climbing, and then have some sense of um, um, enjoying being a flexible, athletic person doing these things. That's in the games. Um, a focus on killing non-player agents in duels or assassinations, right? One of the things that's core to the games is you're going to kill people. Odyssey is a little different than some in that the number of people it allows you to kill stretch way beyond just the targets for assassination, which is why we got it this title. Because you can murder peasants simply because you want to murder peasants. And I think that tells us something important about how this particular history is shaped and how it sort of approaches the world. Combat system, hit points, armor, weapon damage, and complex collision models, right? Where's your hand relative to their shield and where's your body? And this is all being modeled in a 3PA game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Okay, now let's look at Hegemony War of Ancient Greece. Wars of Ancient Greece. This came out maybe about 12 years ago. It's a real-time strategy. If you've ever played one, that's like Age of Empires, the old Warcraft, not World of Warcraft, Command and Conquer, and there have been a bunch of recent ones. Real-time strategies tend to have a set of genre features, and these are the genre features I think you can kind of find there. You have an unembodied player agent. Your character is not represented in the world. Rather, you are using your camera to zoom around the world. I like to call that an experimenting deity approach. Basically, it's like you're a god saying, hey, let's try this out on my people down here and see what happens. Oops, that didn't work. 50,000 million people died. I'll try something else, right? It's really very much this having ants going around and doing things sort of approach. Small set of core resources, like wealth and food, especially in this game, but in lots of games. Manufacturing, the ability to build, produce resources and build units is very common with RTSs. Passable and unpassable terrain, stuff that you cannot walk through and stuff that you can walk through. A hit point damage model that's based on unit combat, not based on representing where Cassandra's body is relative to the enemy's body and where their weapons are and stuff like that. These tend to be more simplified. Here's one unit, here's another unit. We will animate them fighting, and then we'll subtract a specific amount of damage every second or every 5 seconds or something like that. The game world space is at its most flexible in game real-time strategies. There's some things in real-time strategies that one can do that one doesn't usually do in third-person adventures. You can cross the space. That's true of both games. You can explore the space. That's true of both games. You can't develop the space in a third-person adventure game usually. By that I mean taking resources from a space on the game and using them to further your ends. Contesting a space, not so much in the third person. You can fight, but you're not really fighting over the space. You're fighting to figure out who's going to win the duel. But in a real-time strategy, space and capturing it and contesting it is important. And then finally, controlling it and exploiting it. These are like the full array of things that one can usually do as action choices in a game world. All right, so that's a big overview. Now let's look at this some more. And here, what I'd like you to do is pay attention to how different these are. The historical problem space framework is at its best, I think, these days. It's a work in progress when it's comparing, when it's used for comparison, because it really gives you a way to organize and use some terminology and sort of say, okay, how are these parts similar or different for each other? So we're going to look at a few. Player agents, right? The player agent is not quite the same as the player. It's the player and the character that they're playing in the game, the player agent. So it's the person with the primary action. One of the things that comes up immediately if you're thinking about the history is, what kind of 5th century Greek mercenary was even like Cassandra? Wow, that's an unfortunate frozen screen. Look at that excitement going on there. Let's try that, see if we can get that back. She has the ability, she is the most super fit gymnast in the world. She is a trained killer. She can bounce around in all sorts of spectacular ways, fighting and climbing and looting and all these things. She is termed a mistheos, which is a Greek word for mercenary. Yet she is so far beyond the abilities of a mercenary historically in that period, right? She is functionally superhuman in her ability to fight, to climb, to traverse. Same time, if you look at Hegemony, where you play as the Athenian player, who had godlike powers to monitor humans like this and compel them to act like they do in Hegemony? So these are both player agents that are very different, very much fitting in with their uh, genres, but not very much fitting necessarily the historical record. Okay, so if we look at Cassandra, we've got this assassin. She's an embodied agent. She has superhuman abilities. These are all parts of a third-person adventure game. And they're all part of an Assassin's Creed game. An assassin that's in a physical body and has superhuman abilities. Not magic, right? But super powerful. The big thing that Cassandra does that's historical actually has very little to do with her assassinating and her parkour and stuff like that. The big thing that she does that's historical is witnesses. That's the action that she can take the most, that links the game most to the history. And it's Assassin's Creed, right? So the visuals and the sounds are everywhere, and they're rich and they're detailed, and the developers try to do a good job to model it on historical evidence that we have. So you have a history here that's creating a player agent that's mostly going to engage with the past in terms of witnessing. And what do you know? It's a game that's lavish in its audios and its visuals. Okay. Same time, the Athenian player agent in Hegemony is very much a functional, cohesive, real-time strategy genre choice for a player agent. Commanding is the most important thing they do. Cassandra can physically attack people. The commander can order people. Neither can do the other. They're unembodied. You just have a camera floating about. The camera is pretty powerful in Hegemony. You can zoom in. You can zoom out from place to place. You're a state agent. You're basically acting like the Athenian state, if the Athenian state were an abstract phenomenon that existed as a video game. And finally, again, you have these experimenting deity abilities. The ability to try things out, experiment with characters that represent beings, and try something different if you don't like how that turned out. So, again, bottom line, the way that the player agents are represented in the two games are different. And you know what I just realized? I missed an important point in all my fussing about with the technology here. Both of these games, right, are focusing on 5th century Greece, and I should have made that point. The very reason that we're looking at them is they both cover the Peloponnesian War. And so, in a sense, their content is the same, or rather, the historical facts, if you will, or the historical record is the same for both. One Peloponnesian War, we've got the documents that we've got. There's a lot we don't understand, but there's a historical record. So right here, you see these two player agents are going to focus on different things in that historical record. And it's not the historical record that's changed. It's the game that's changed. All right. So you can really see this if you try and figure out what would happen if the players were if the player agents were swapped. If for some reason, what if you could keep everything else the same in each game, but just switch the player agents? I would argue that it would be a very different game. So suppose you put a third-person agent, an embodied agent with personal powers, and you know, and sort of a strict camera view and things like that, and you put them into Hegemony. But everything else was the same in Hegemony. Cassandra would have to run around the entire Peloponnesus giving orders, and nobody could hear her orders when she wasn't near them. And if she ever wanted to see her units in battle, she would have to go up onto a mountaintop or something like to see her units in battle. It doesn't work because the problem space design for that game was not made for a third-person player agent. You can look at it the other way as well. If you play Hegemony, you'll find that you can often be a leader character, like a general of some sort. And as that general, you move that general around on screen, and it's very much a real-time agent like everybody else. And when it actually, the only time it's useful is when you join it physically to a unit. So again, they're trying as quickly as possible to keep you in the unembodied high-level player agent model. The same would be the other way, right? If you had a real-time unembodied strategy, I mean, I guess it would be sort of just, hey, take an aerial tour of 5th century Greece. Let's suppose we have everything in the game the same in Assassin's Creed. This is just a thought experiment, except for the character, and the character's an unembodied experimenting deity. Well, it no longer would be the wandering journeys of an individual with character. There'd be no body, no armor. You can't have physical fights if you don't have bodies and you don't have armor and you don't have weapons. There's not going to be stealth anymore, because how do you be stealthy as an unembodied agent? You just go click, I guess, and you're done. So those player agents are representing radically different ways of representing the past, radically different problem spaces, but each one fits for the game that it was designed for. Okay, geographies and architecture. So player agents are different. Geographies and architecture are also different. With Assassin's Creed, you're going for verisimilitude. Sorry, it's my favorite word. I don't know if it's my favorite word. Um, Trying to go for realistic representations of the physical world. And so you see these beautiful reconstructed temples and geography and everything like that. And it is a visual representation, but also a physics and parkour simulation. They're simulating running and jumping and climbing and falling and things like that. And they spend a lot of time having that work with physics that resemble the real world as much as possible. Okay. If you look at Hegemony, on the other hand, the real-time strategy, the buildings in there and the geography, they're about logistics, basically. The cities, for example, you can either hide in them, in which case you don't even see your unit, or you can be outside them. You can't navigate, you can't climb them, you can't jump on top of them. And again, this may be obvious, but why can't you? Because they designed it not to be that way. That would have made it more like Assassin's Creed Odyssey. They were creating a different genre. So I hope you're starting to see that the historical problem space is very much shaped by the genre that each game belongs to. So again, you've got symbolism and logistics and in one and then not in the other. But suppose you coded them differently. Suppose you coded the buildings in Hegemony so that they could model 3D logistics. I'm simplifying for a second. Let's just throw out there's probably some kind of variables being stored in the game that keep track of whether you're successfully holding on to a handhold or not. Is there a ledge? Is there something that will stop your fall? If that was all coded in there in the Hegemony game, it would be useless. An unembodied agent can't climb up things, can't stand on things. So the architecture itself, if you swapped it, would make very little sense. There'd be very little cohesion. And it also wouldn't function very well in the code, arguably. So the geography and the architecture are very different as a result. Okay, so the big one. Peasants, non-player agents, and systems of agriculture. So why can you shove peasants aside in Assassin's Creed Odyssey? You can assault them. You can murder them, but they can't grow any food. There's no food. I think Valhalla has some food in it, but as far as I know, there is no food, by which I mean nothing that you can take and go through the process of eating. There's simulations, as you can see from the picture. She's hiding in the wheatgrass here before I demonstrated that she could, in fact, murder those peasants, because it was important for me to say, well, how far does this go? So, in Hegemony, on the other hand, peasants have almost no physical representation. If you capture a farm, there's a farm there in the little green circle below that's in sort of the bigger yellow circle. That farm represents crops being grown over seasons. It's got a model of seasons, it's got a model of agriculture, and assuming nobody burns it, which is something that can happen in Hegemony, then you produce a certain amount of food. And that food is critically important in the game because units require food in Hegemony. And if they don't get the food that they require, then the agents become very, very vulnerable. Very easy to defeat almost completely or almost immediately. So, what are they doing? They're not doing this. The game Assassin's Creed has, and they didn't intend to do this, right? They didn't intend to make an RTS style game. So, what they've done is created oral and visual presentations of a peasant. Those peasants have conversations, they have barks that are recorded, and you can go near them and you can listen to them, and they may or may not be close to what you're used to when you're researching historical Greek questions. That's not my area of expertise or what street people were talking about, but it's modeling the audio and the visual. And again, think about that. That's playing to Cassandra's strengths about witnessing. Okay. She is able to witness the peasants, and that means she can hear them and she can see them. And that fits with a game that has been designed around an embodied third person agent with witnessing abilities. So the peasants are modeled as objects that can be killed. They're not, okay, so if you think about it, right, you can say, well, the peasants aren't really being simulated procedurally. They're just a visual of them. There's nothing about them as far as like eating and farming and producing food and stuff like that that's being modeled. True. But there still is something very much being modeled in that game about those peasants. And that's their physics as bodies, and that's their ability to be killed. And that's also their reactions when somebody attacks them. It's horrific. They end up crying and whining and running away. It's an awful experience. I don't know why you'd really want to do it more than once to see how it worked. Um, but those are very detailed in their simulations, the physics of it, the body looking realistic in its motions. They probably used motion capture. I don't know. But the point is, whether they did or they did not, they are spending a lot of energy making a procedural simulation of bodies in space. And they're spending a lot of time putting a representation of those bodies in space that has the language and has the visible appearance and clothing and stuff. But they're not modeling food and food production for the simple reason that's not what the game required. They could have made it, but it wouldn't add anything necessarily to the game, or you could add it in different ways. You have no logistics management on a large scale in Assassin's Creed Odyssey in the way that you do in Hegemony. So that's an important part of the difference too. Notice how they're actually representing peasants and farming and agriculture is very different for each one. Different media, different history. Okay. And then my favorite. These are Peloponnesian War games, right? Why does Cassandra fight the Peloponnesian War single-handedly? Okay. Here's the process if you haven't played. Basically, you've got this map of Greece, and you can see it up there at the top right of all these regions. And each of those regions is under the control of Spartans or Athenians. And you can decide to go on a conquest mission. And what that does is that basically allows you to take one of these regions and give it to either Sparta or Athens, right? Because it's the Peloponnesian War, the Great War between Athens and Sparta, starting in 431. So Peloponnesian War, and a lot of the characters are speaking about the war and things like that. And so this fits in. They wanted to have this aspect. When I saw this and played it a little bit, this is what inspired the whole article. I said, oh my God, they've taken the Peloponnesian War with units and damage and thousands of soldier and food and logistics and supplies and turned it into an Assassin's Creed game. Here's how. To do a conquest mission as Cassandra, you got to lower the nation power of that region that you're in. Okay, once the nation power gets low enough, then a sort of a final takeover battle will come, which I'll explain in a second. Okay, so to lower a nation power, in this case, I believe I'm lowering Athenian nation power. You've got two things that you can do in the region. You can murder soldiers and officers, and you can destroy war chests. And so Cassandra goes around doing her sneaking or being brazen. It depends on how you're feeling about Cassandra at that point. And she single-handedly, and I can't stress that enough, single-handedly duels or stealthily assassinates the soldiers, the officers, whoever she chooses and able to do that with. And she burns the chest. Her alone. She's the one that does this. Okay? When she's assaulting a region, she can't command troops. She doesn't command anyone. She just simply, as an agent, goes through and does these individual things. She's a super spy. She's a lone super spy and a supreme martial artist. The war is being presented in that form. Now, this is not to say that, I am well aware, and I'm a big fan of Ubisoft's games. I'm sure they're well aware that this is not what the Peloponnesian War worked like for thousands and thousands of people. But it's an Assassin's Creed game, and the genre demands something like this. It would be very uncohesive to have a different kind of play style that was more like a real-time strategy. Oftentimes, when game developers try to put in radically different genres, it doesn't work very well. Players don't actually like it that often. Anyways, this depiction of the Peloponnesian War, the going through, doing the spy thing, okay? Well, there's nothing it really maps onto really well. Sieges were very important in the Peloponnesian War, okay? And to a lesser extent, but still important, some combined arms fighting, hoplites, light infantry, cavalry, and things like that. But of course, nothing in the evidence suggests, even the fact that A, there were bosses that needed to be reduced, B, nothing in the game or nothing in our history suggests that there were fortresses in every region. Athens and Sparta couldn't afford to put fortresses in each region garrisoned with soldiers. But those are the people that need to be there for a third-person action-adventure Assassin's Creed Odyssey game. Okay? Now, when she gets to the conquest battle, it's great. It's continuing along. This is not the history of the Peloponnesian War. This is an Assassin's Creed history of the Peloponnesian War. So there's no organized formations. This is my central picture here. It's a brawl. The armies aren't even facing in different directions. There's no like battle line that everybody's facing on one side or another. There's no direction of attack. There's no front. There's no rear. There's just these scattered duels all across the battlefield. Every once in a while, somebody with a roaming pole axe up there, one of the big dudes comes around and they're harder to kill, or there's harder to kill captains. But basically, it's just a brawl of these little battles. And Cassandra, she should have been in Homer. She should have been in the Iliad. She's having she's like Diomedes. They call it an Aristeia, right? When Diomedes has his big kind of going through and kicking butt stage. And that's what Cassandra is doing. She's striking, she's dodging, she's grateful. She uses her special abilities, she kills, she blocks, and she's doing all this. The course of the entire battle is determined maybe not completely, but almost completely about how many powerful warriors Cassandra took out. So she fights the Peloponnesian War single-handedly, basically. Because it is true there'll be other people fighting in that conquest battle, but I've lost enough times to know that if Cassandra doesn't win, nobody wins the battle. This is an Assassin's Creed third-person adventure view of Greek combat. Now, if you look at Hegemony, Wars of Ancient Greece, you've got a very different model of Peloponnesian War combat. Here, you've got logistics and supply. What's important, though, to remember is the historical record about the Peloponnesian War, such as it is, right? Ancient history has a lot of mystery in it. There's many things we don't know. But the historical record, such as it is, has not changed. It is whatever it is, right? The things that we've written and argued and discussed and debated and everything like that, it's all out there. That's not what changed. What changed is one form of game genre looked at it, and then another form of game genre looked at it. Although in this case, they're in reverse order, because Hegemony came first. So the record hasn't changed. The mode of history has changed, the way the historical problem space has been designed. So you got this unembodied Athenian state player agent commanding units of soldiers. That is a hallmark of real-time strategy games. And of course, it's going to be how Hegemony approaches this because it very much fits the real-time strategy game mode. Okay, there are units, they march, they adopt formations if you have more than one selected, and they can do these various things. They're subordinate agents. They're not full minions because there's a really neat morale model involved, and soldiers can decide that they no longer want to fight and will run away. So they're subordinates. They're meant for the player agent to control, but they're not minions. And you can contrast how a region gets taken over in Hegemony Rome with how Cassandra. The player agent orders. There's no body to participate. You are not participating in the war. Okay, you are not disrupting local supply lines. You're ordering your units to go and do these things. And it could be one individual unit or a bunch, but there's still many more, and none of them are you. Um, when a battle ensues, as opposed to the brawl battle, one-on-one duels like the Iliad, the player agent, within to some extent, will have some ability to organize their soldiers' formations if they have time, if they caught it close enough. Or they could pick separate targets for each of their formations. And the units all have strengths and weaknesses. There's cavalry units that are faster and really good at taking out light infantry that's faster than heavy infantry and really good at throwing spears at the heavy infantry, and the hoplite phalanx, which is slow as it was, but if it ever catches light infantry or cavalry, it's going to maul it. Once units clash, though, there's little chance of disengaging. Cassandra can disengage all the time. It's one of her great powers. They will continue fighting until one side's morale is spent. Then the demoralized unit will flee the battlefield and risk being captured and enslaved by the victorious army. Um, it's important to note that Longbow's practice of letting historical content drive genre. This is something that was important to them as they were designing the game. They really wanted to have historical content inform how they did the game. But don't let that hide the fact that Hegemony is still a game history. It is no more and no less a game history with game conventions than Assassin's Creed Odyssey is. It takes a horrible, messy, awful human affair, battle, and it turns it into a quantifiable, functional, and cohesive set of world and systems. The units have hit points and weapon damage. That's a game feature, right? Hit points don't exist in the real world, or weapon damage that can be counted. Okay, its units gain experience in battle and skill points that allow the player agents to upgrade units along 4 tracks: heroics, initiative, logistics. Again, this is a representation of the world. This is not the world itself. And of course, the camera can zoom from place to place. It can travel 1,000 miles in a second and then zoom in and out and then go back somewhere else in ways that did not happen historically. So these are just some of the RTS features. The ability to zoom in and out alone is fantastic. An ancient general would weep at the amount of power a player has to be able to zoom in, zoom out, select things, and have them go to different targets. At the end of the day, Hegemony is shaping its history, just like Assassin's Creed is shaping its history. And it's probably worth noting when you're thinking about this, Hegemony was originally designed as a turn-based game. So even the very act of the little soldiers running around and stuff like that in real time, that was an addition to fit a real-time strategy. The original strategy was square hexes and units that would fight, which again is an interpretation of the past, not the past itself. Okay, so what kind of history is Odyssey? And what kind of history is Hegemony? Assassin's Creed Odyssey is very much an Assassin's Creed genre-centered historical problem space, and it's focused on the trials and tribulations of Cassandra, the individual. She's powerful, she's athletic, she interacts with all these people in the world and witnesses them, and ostensibly they're the people of, or representations of the people of 5th century Greece. She encounters all sorts of people talking about their lives. She can ignore some of them talk with her. Sometimes she can get favors. Sometimes she can get quests. Okay. She can also kill a lot of them, a feature that was taken away. There's nobody, I think, that you cannot kill except for maybe a permanent quest figure or something like that. Okay. So she's going through and she's seeing all these people and she's making the difference. And she must complete enough quests from meeting with these people that she gets the experience to increase her abilities. Because only when she gets to a sufficient level can she solve the highest level quests and solve the problem of the was it the cult of Cosmos, I think, or the Cosmos cultists. I would argue, people will argue with me, and it's perfectly fine, that in some ways this makes Assassin's Creed Odyssey a great person history. Now, great person history is usually contrasted with like social history. So a great person history is when you have famous people that you focus on rather than the everyday people like us. On one hand, Assassin's Creed is a social history because you get to go around and see people, rich and poor, simulated and interacting and talking and things like that. But I would argue it has a strong great person edge because you get to do whatever you want. And as long as you play successfully, you are unstoppable. You stop the cultists. You handle the quests. You're responsible for everything. And while Cassandra has a kind of sort of unheroic opening, she actually has a heroic lineage, right? probably too late to spoil it, but she has a heroic lineage. And she does come to be the most important person in that game world in many important ways. Hegemony, on the other hand, gives you the logistician's battle. It's focusing instead on the idea of an unembodied state agent that's controlling units, seeing the world much like a state does. There's a great book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State. The complex realities of the world have been simplified into soldiers, cities, workers, and supplies, and terrain that either affects your movement or affects your ability to fight. You don't participate in anything. You order and you see how things go about. And the way the game is represented, you're not particularly given any motivation to be upset when 49 people are left in your 50-person unit because one died, or 48. They become sort of numbers. When you zoom out, they are nameless and faceless. Actually, they're nameless even when you go in. Even the figures that are rendered in game, like Pericles, their only function in the game is to contribute to the war and the logistics model. Okay, this is a model about structures. It's about systems history rather than it is about an individual that's going around. There's it's philosophically sort of a long-term systems look. This is how a war would take place over time, over the years, with these big important variables like food and fighting and stuff like that. The question of which game is accurate and which one's not, it's too limiting a question to ask for a deep analysis of these games. You'd have to explore it more. But what you can say is both games shape their historical phenomena, the stuff in the game, according to their genre-centered historical problem space. You could simply say that Odyssey inaccurately portrays the war, but that's a binary evaluation. That's not looking at the medium of the game itself. Okay, you can say that Hegemony accurately betrays the war, but that's kind of arbitrary too. Like if you've ever seen real-time units as they all kind of glom together in battle, Hegemony's units do that too. And it's hard to say at that point that it's realistic versus unrealistic. A more complex analysis, and one that your students can do, and one that you may be interested in doing as well, is look at how each game portrays the Peloponnesian War. And so there we have it. Peasant farmers are murder victims. And I think you'll find as you go out into the world and play historical games, pay attention to different genres of games. Pay attention to how the genre shapes things. The historical problem space framework, it doesn't explain every design choice, but it factors in design decisions. What were the constructions that were made that made this cohesive and made this functional? Thank you very much. That's it for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jeremiah. I want to broadcast and tell you there's applause in the audience. I'm not sure if you can see it or not.
Thank you.
I also want to use this opportunity to invite anyone up to the Q&A line. You want questions or just comments for Jeremiah and his presentation here. And feel free to share it in the chat if you'd like as well. I'm seeing some movement. People might be approaching the mic here soon. I do have a question myself, actually, as we're waiting for some people to move around.
Oh, let me stop sharing my screen.
Sure.
Well, thank you.
So in your presentation, you kind of compared a lot between real-time strategy and the third-person view. I'm curious, any thoughts on more turn-based approaches?
Thoughts as far as do they do the same thing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
can we have a representative depiction of history? If it is turn-based, we have, quote unquote, limited time to make the decision.
Yeah, so a couple of answers. One, every game design is turning it into a historical problem space. So I have not seen a game yet, and there may be one, right? But at a certain point, right, the inherent definition of a game for most people is some kind of competition or quest or goal seeking. You got set goals, and there's a world that you can kind of move through. So turn-based is an important distinction, but it's still going to do very similar things, obviously by like the breaking up of time. What I would say is that at some point along the way, you're not going to kind of find your perfect medium. You're going to represent things. I mean, it's old Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message," right? Because um, if you write a narrative history, you are locking in that history to certain understandings, and you are locking the readers into certain understandings, if they agree with you at least. For example, books and narrative history books have a beginning, a middle, and an end, do they not? Well,
Ew.
life doesn't usually have quite as clean demarcations, right? In events and things like that, right? We don't necessarily, although we do, I suppose, right? We tell ourselves stories and we sort of kind of link things up that way. But narrative itself is imposing its own kind of medium onto history. So turn-based, I think, is great. And what I would say is, for me as for me as an academic, I'm just fascinated in the different ways people can approach these things and why. Me as a teacher, I would say, and I'll talk some more about this this afternoon, is that get your students to critique the models. Get them to talk to you about how turn-based is better or worse or different actually, than these other versions. So yeah, whatever you find, you're going to end up with that. And um, yeah,
Thank you very much. That's an
sure.
excellent answer, and I will continue to try and push my students to critique their sources. They usually give out a third week. But we have another Daniel with a question.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi, Jeremiah. Been following you in Blue Sky for a while, so nice to see you. Yeah, it's just to really, I guess, pick up on that kind of point then, that I think for a lot of people, the idea of history or historical events when they're being presented in games or in any kind of media, there's a lot of people get, I guess, kind of quite worked up about historical inaccuracy.
Mhm.
But I'm kind of really pick up that from your point of view, the inaccuracy is really just a teaching point. It's
Yep.
something for discussion, and so it doesn't really matter how accurate the history is at all, so much as it's in that setting, and then you can discuss. Is that a fair assessment, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. I'm not a complete historical deconstructionist. I don't think you. I know this is a throwdown to history teachers everywhere, but I don't think you can actually teach history to people where you grade it without having some sense that some definitions and interpretations are more valid than others. And if some are more valid than others, you're not a full deconstructionist, right? Yeah. I think knowing what's accurate and what's not can be really useful. And if I were using this in a class, I absolutely would be wanting to get them to pick at it. That's actually one of the things I think are so nice about historical games is they can, under a teacher's guidance, really pull out from students an analysis. They're not used to critiquing textbooks and teachers, but they probably could do a pretty good job with games. So yeah, I would say it is the act of critique, of analysis and critique, that's the most important thing. If I, just to be slightly flip, right? If I picked up a potato and said, this potato is like the Peloponnesian War, I don't know why. I mean, I suppose I could have picked up a dragon fruit, but in any event, right? This vegetable or whatever it is looks like the Peloponnesian War. Why? You guys go ahead and start critiquing. That act of critiquing is, I think, really good educationally. So yeah, I would rather focus on how the games represent the past. And I think the only other thing I'd say too is I like text. I've written 6 books. There's nothing wrong with text. But at the end of the day, we only think it's the way for history because we've had text around for about 5,000 years. That hopefully that's not all of human history, right? Hopefully in this world we will continue to move on. But why can't games and other things be history if they're doing that job? And shouldn't we be critically looking at everybody's representation of the past to see if it fits what we think the evidence is? That's a great question. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think just to also just broaden that out even more, I guess, I think it reminds me of some of the discussions with game-based learning more generally for the past 20 years, where there is some people who come up with this view of we're going to create this game is going to teach. Students are going to learn by doing this game, and then there's an opposing view which is, well, in many cases, maybe what we should be doing is having the game, let students learn in the game, but we've not completed that until we've actually had a discussion with teachers and in a framework where we're kind of almost like doing that debrief and saying, and what did you learn from this?
Mhm.
You know, and that's kind of an important part of kind of closing a learning loop,
Yeah.
more generally and outside of history as a sort of field.
No, I think you're right. So we're closing in on the 19th anniversary of my first speaking about games. I was out in LA at Education Arcade or something like that. And the thing that shocked people, which showed you that there were a lot more game designers and college academics than high school teachers. The thing that shocked them is I said, I want them to look at civilization not as a textbook, but as a model. It's a secondary source, and you need to be aware of where it fits and where it doesn't fit. So yeah, I completely agree with you. The it's about process, right? We haven't say that it's about process rather than product. What kind of thinking can they do, and what can they rally sort of to do that? Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
And just
Well,
a
thanks
brief
again,
comment
folks.
myself.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned, the use of the text is not wrong, but worth mentioning, the text content can be wrong too. There's no, set in stone one text that is the true history of everything.
Right. I mean that's absolutely true. I mean, you know, it depends how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, right? I mean, a lot of people have said, and I'm not the first one to say it, certainly, that in this world we're having our students negotiate, right? It comes down to who you trust. And with all these different media and messages and claims being made out there, who do you think has the legitimate ones? And I guess I don't fix that, right? Because
Yeah.
they have to trust me to be able to do any of this analysis. But at the end of the day, if I can at least get them into the habit of, yeah, knowing that text is a construct. Look at a painting. A painting can be history. What's it going to leave in and what's it going to leave out? Then I'm hoping that they're better off as far as thinking about this. But yeah, text is absolutely as problematic. I have written many things that many people would think are wrong and perhaps are.
Yeah, and my favorite example I always bring up is many of us in the U.S. are taught about the American Revolution. Those in the Commonwealth are taught about the American Uprising.
Right, right.
Both true in different ways.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Well, any other questions we have from the audience? Seeing some excellent comments of appreciation here.
Yeah, thanks. If I can be of any help to anybody, it's really easy to find me. My email is scattered throughout the net. You can go to gamingthepast.net. I'm always happy to talk shop.
And I'm not seeing any other questions come up here, so I do want to make sure we give you a break because our next presenter will be Jeremiah McCall coming up at 2 p.m. Central Time. So,
All right. I look forward to it. I will see you all then, hopefully.
we'll see you then. And to all of our other attendees here, please take this time to take a break, get a snack, go walk around as you need. But we will be returning here to the same conference space at 2 p.m. Central Time, about 33 minutes from now, for our next presentation from Jeremiah McCall and others throughout the afternoon.